No matter where you live in the United States, I'm fairly certain your area has been hit somewhat by the explosion of homelessness, which has swept across the country in the last decade or so. From the big cities to the small towns, you seemingly can't escape from seeing them standing at the street corner, panhandling, gathering around a center for food and aid, or just sitting on the sidewalks. Some are simply victims of circumstances, be they the rising cost of living, rents, and mortgages going astronomical in price, or some other unforeseen run of bad luck. Some are victims of their own vices, throwing the money which could put a roof over their heads, or a job to provide set money away for the booze and drugs they're addicted to. And some are the leftovers from the deinstitutionalization that occurred in the mid-80s under President Reagan. Whatever the case may be, they're everywhere now. I work as an investigative journalist in my medium-sized coastal town. Population about 10,000. I'm someone whose hunger for finding the truth and tenaciousness has caused me to rise through the ranks in my town's newspaper. From the humble beginnings working freelance, to 4 years later having a dedicated spot on the staff. The gentlemen who run it have always been appreciative of the stories I break. From the drug runners bringing fentanyl up from Mexico, whose photographs I took not only earned a front page picture, but also multiple arrests, to the story of a local preschool who, shall we just say, was up to less than scrupulous things with the money paid to by the parents of the children they had left in their charge. That's why I ended up getting called into Kevin, our main editor's office a month or two ago, sitting in the comfortable leather armchair opposite him. "So, what's the latest scoop you'd like me on, sir?" I asked as I sipped on a cup of coffee he'd offered me. He stood up, moved from behind his desk, and closed the door, flipping the blinds closed as well. "How well have you been listening to the police scanners over the last few months?" he asked as he sat back down, lacing his fingers behind his head. I pulled in a deep breath through my nose as I contemplated, then let it out again. "Honestly, ever since that hopped-up kid attacked his neighbor with a set of garden shears, not closely," I admitted to him. "I thought not," he admitted, leaning forwards. My curiosity was now aroused, and I leaned forward as well. "Why? What's been going on?" His face didn't hold his trademark smirk, which meant I was about to be handed a very serious case. "The local police have been noticing that quite a few of the homeless population in the town limits have been, well, shall we say, pulling a Houdini." I cocked my head. "You mean they're just disappearing? As in, for some reason heading off to other cities and towns?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "I mean, they're not showing up anywhere else. Hell, it's like they're just dropping off the face of the earth." Now Kevin had my full attention. "Have you heard how many?" I asked him. In my head, the two sides of my mind were already doing battle with each other. On the one hand, I felt nothing but sympathy for those who were vanishing. On the other, the journalistic side of my brain could tell this might make one hell of a story. Kevin shook his head again. "I haven't heard an exact number, but since January, it's been something like 60 or 70 of them." I felt my jaw drop slightly at his words. Holy crap. In our town, 60 or 70 was a significant amount, even with the amount of new homeless who would show up regularly, oftentimes buzzed in from the larger cities who wanted a way to get them out of their hair. Before he had a chance to tell me everything further, the phone on his desk rang. I tuned out his conversation as I drank the now cooling coffee and stared out the window at the coastline below the bluffs the newspaper office sat on. What on earth could cause so many of these people to just up and vanish in such a short amount of time? My mind flickered to human trafficking for a moment. The homeless would make perfect targets for those in that profession. It also wandered over to the possibility, as equally disturbing and dangerous as it may be, that it could be a serial killer targeting the homeless specifically. "Nate?" Kevin's voice shook me from my inner speculations, and I focused again on him. The look on his face, if possible, grimmer than it had been before, clued me in that the call had something to do with what we've been discussing. They just found the body of one of the missing homeless down on the beach. A couple of kids unfortunately discovered it while out enjoying themselves. "Oh great," I groaned, knowing there'd be years of therapy in store for both of them and their parents. He nodded. "I want you down there to speak to the police, since you're on good terms with them. Find out what you can, pictures or no pictures." He stood up, and I mirrored his movements. He gestured towards the door. "As of now, you're officially attached to this case." 10 minutes later, I buzzed through the mid-afternoon traffic clogging up the streets, my aging Chevy Corsica easily able to slip between the larger SUVs and crossovers. As I drove up the road opposite the beach, my mind drifted off, wondering about the case. In journalism, they teach you to focus on 6 specific parts of a story. Who, what, when, where, how, and why. I knew the where right now, but I needed to concentrate on the remaining 5 areas. Seeing the flash of the police lights ahead, I slowed and pulled into one of the diagonal parking spaces not occupied by cop cars, ambulances, or in the case of the black Cadillac at the end of the line, the coroner. I walked up to the officer stationed ahead of the yellow police tape, a young man in his mid-20s I knew well.
"Hey Evan, how's it going?"
I called as I approached. He squinted into the overcast afternoon at me and smiled.
"Hey Nate, they got you working this case already?"
He asked, raising a hand, which I took with a firm shake.
"Yeah, you know Kevin,"
I said. He always puts me on the grim cases the others can't stomach. It earned a laugh, which I genuinely reciprocated. Then he grew serious.
"It's a bad one, man,"
he said, looking for all the world a little green around the gills. I was surprised. The man was a bull, able to take almost anything.
"How bad?"
I asked, and he held up the police tape to let me under.
"See for yourself,"
he said before offering.
"Ray's down there right now."
Giving him a last look, I headed down the path to where it intersected with the sandy beach. Almost instantly, I had to cover my nose at the putrid stench which wafted from where the large circle of people stood. God, that reeks. Thankfully, I'd only had coffee and no lunch. I crossed the sand, where a surly-looking detective looked up at my approach. He quickly hurried over to me, holding up a hand.
"Hold up there, Nate,"
he said. Detective Ray Broadbent, all 6'5" of him, looked like the man in his late 40s had already hurled his lunch at least once before. I stopped and looked at him.
"Is it that bad, Ray?"
I asked gently. He nodded.
"I can't say much due to it being an ongoing investigation, but between you and me, Nate, this is one of the worst bodies I've seen, either here or when I worked in Portland."
I gestured down to the camera dangling from my neck. He shook his head.
"No pictures this time, I'm afraid,"
he said.
"Captain's orders."
I pulled out my notebook, flipping it open.
"Well, could you at least give me a few basic details?"
I asked him. He seemed to mentally argue with himself for a moment, then nodded. I pulled out my pen.
"Do you have any idea as to the identity of the victim?"
I asked.
"On the record, no,"
he said. "Ongoing investigation." I looked up at his choice of words, lowering the pad. He sighed.
"Off the record though?"
"Yeah, I do. It's old Fred." I almost dropped the notebook. Old Fred had become homeless due to circumstances surrounding the closing of the local VA. The man was always kind and polite, and I always made sure to give him a 20 or a 50 when I was able to. Ray saw my expression. "Whoever did this, they're a monster," he mumbled out. He kept mumbling. What kind of sick individual cuts into a man, looking for all the world like something bit a chunk out of him? He stopped, realizing what he had done. "Don't print that," he ordered, sterner than usual. I raised my hands soothingly, to which he seemed to relax a little and nod. Even though I could stomach a lot, the detective's words made me realize I didn't want to see the body. Not if it looked like that. I decided to try and stay professional.
"Does the coroner have an approximate time of death?"
I asked him, holding up my notepad again. He nodded.
"Yeah, Dr. Baxter says he died about midnight last night."
I scribbled it down.
"What about any leads and suspects?"
I asked. He shook his head.
"Can't disclose that, my friend,"
he said. I nodded, flipping the notebook closed and sliding it into my coat pocket.
"I'm sorry, I can't give anything out for the moment. Not even to you,"
he said firmly, then turned and began walking back towards the circle of people. I watched him go, the chilly sea breeze temporarily pushing away the body's foul odor. I knew this place would reek of it for days to come, if not weeks. Turning to the left, I decided to begin walking down the deserted beach, just to see if I could see anything of interest. As I turned, I shot one glance back at the group of officers and medical professionals, and I'd chosen the wrong time to look. A few of the men and women parted, allowing a clear view in for about 4 seconds. It was 4 seconds too long. I saw the bald, bearded face of old Fred. His eyes were wide open and glassy. His mouth was eternally wrenched open in a scream. The look of sheer horror on his face was bone-chilling to say the least. I also saw the huge gaping wound in his chest. Oh, sweet baby Jesus. Ray hadn't been exaggerating. It looked like something had taken a ginormous bite out of his midsection. Thankfully, I didn't see any more detail as the group closed up again, trying to push the image out of my mind, but knowing I'd be seeing it in my dreams tonight for sure. I turned and quickly walked away, trying to inhale the cold sea spray and not blow chunks everywhere. It seemed to help somewhat, as I felt my racing heart begin to slow and my breathing normalize. I looked around. If it weren't for the throng of officers behind me, along with the remains of Old Fred, it would almost seem peaceful. Seagulls called overhead, some landing on the beach and strutting around. The sound of the lighthouse foghorn blared somewhere out in the distance, indicating a fog bank was beginning to roll in. Well, means I don't have very long out here, I said to myself. When the fog rolls in our town, you can barely find your way around the beach and accidentally walk straight into the ocean. As the thought went through my head, my eye was caught by the glint of something in the sand. I looked down, one eyebrow arching as I recognized what it was. It was a necklace, the 2 silver chains ending in a tiger shark tooth. I also knew who it belongs to. Well, who it belonged to. It was Old Fred's. Stranger still, it looked as though it had been torn. The chain had been torn in two by the clasp and discarded. I raised my camera to my eye, snapping a picture of it, then looked up. That was when I noticed something. About 20 feet away from me, set into the rocky side of the cliff, was what looked like a large drainage pipe. It would have been easy to miss, as it had been painted in a similar color to the rocks to hide it from beachgoers, no doubt to give the area a more natural look. Out of curiosity, I approached it, and spied another object glinting in the overcast light, this time gold. I reached the lip of the pipe and bent down to look closer. It was a golden wedding band. To be more specific, it was Fred's wedding band. It had been the last truly valuable object he'd had, a memory of his long-past wife. He'd refused to hawk it for any amount of money, it having too much sentimental value to him. But wait, if this is his ring, why isn't it on his hand anymore? I looked back down the beach. I could still see the mass of people crowding around the body. Then I looked down again. I raised my camera, snapping a photo of it, then looked inside the pipe itself. I could tell it went rather far back, although I couldn't see all the way. The blackness consumed everything about 40 feet in, and it's just big enough to crouch walk into, I thought. For a moment, I looked back to where Ray stood among the others. I knew the smart thing to do would be to run back and report what I found. But something stopped me. You're an investigative journalist, Nathan Harker. So? Investigate. I tried to shake away the growing sensation, but eventually, it overwhelmed me. I wasn't going to go in unarmed though. I lifted the bottom of my coat and shirt, revealing the silver glint of the Beretta handgun I always concealed carried. Ever since I'd been threatened by the fentanyl dealers, I'd chosen to get my CC permit and carry the gun whenever I went on assignment. I didn't want to end up dead like so many other journalists had. Taking a deep breath, I dropped my coat and pulled a small flashlight from my coat pocket. Clicking it on, I aimed it into the pipe. I could now see the black interior further. It seemed to stretch away before rounding in a corner about 70 feet in. Glad I'm not claustrophobic, I muttered to myself. Then, crouching, stepped into the pipe. It was slow going, to say the least. The smooth slickness of the pipe was made worse by the slimy algae and seaweed which had become trapped in here when the tide went out. I carefully stepped over it, not wanting to slip and fall. The camera slapped lightly against my chest as I made my way further inside. Suddenly, I stopped. A shiver went up my spine. The instinctive kind you get when you're being watched by someone, but don't see them. I shot my head up and looked down towards the corner, about 15 feet away. I saw nothing. I turned around, looking behind me towards the circle of light. Nothing there either. Maybe I am actually not that good with extremely tight spaces, I thought. I shook my head, then continued on. The worst I was going to find in this pipe watching me would be a rather annoyed crab or something. And yet, the odd feeling remained. I reached the corner finally, peeking my head around it to look down the next stretch. I could see it went even further down, what had to be another 150 feet, give or take a yard or two. I also saw that there were several offshoots, secondary pipes leading off the main one, though I couldn't see where they went from here. I took a deep breath, then began to make my way down the new section. Small shafts of light fell from above, and looking up, could see the outline of what looked like storm grates about 10 to 15 feet above my head. I realized that the pipe must not only keep the tides from collapsing the rocky cliff, but also allow rainwater to drop down and head out to sea. Speaking of which, the smell of the ocean was almost dizzyingly strong in here. It was as though I had a piece of waterlogged seaweed pressed right up against my nose. I noted with an exasperated breath that my sneakers were soaked through, letting out soft squelching sounds as I moved. But just as quickly, the thoughts were banished away out of my head as I saw something which stood out against the black of the pipe. Something smeared on one side of it, about level with my eyes. something which looked very red in the beam of my flashlight. Is that blood? Didn't reach out and press my fingers to it, but leaned closer. It was close enough for confirmation. It indeed was blood, and I honestly had a pretty good hunch as to whose it was, considering the trail of possessions from the entrance. Well, you found your story, Nate? I whispered almost silently to myself. Time to get out of here and call over the cops. I was about to turn and hit back when something caught my eye. Something which poked out just a tiny bit from the next adjoining pipe up ahead. Even from here, I could see the long, dyed green hair dangling over the edge. Tension filled every pore of my body, and I felt every muscle tighten up. Was Fred's killer still here? As I stared, I felt a rather unfamiliar sensation race through my body. Anger. I'm not usually someone who gets angry often, but the mental images of poor old Fred, a man who had never harmed a soul in his life, sent my rage into overdrive. I quickly clicked off the flashlight, then slowly drew my pistol from its holster. If his killer was still here, I would turn him over to the police. After I dealt with him a bit. In retrospect, I know it was stupid, as a killer could probably wipe me out, even armed as much as anyone, but I honestly wasn't thinking straight. Ready or not, you sick fuck. Here I come, I thought venomously, then slowly began crouch walking forward. Whoever it was hadn't noticed my presence, and was lying on what looked like their back just inside the offshoot. I raised the gun, holding it just over my head as I moved to be able to see into the pipe. A forehead came into view. I could see water droplets sitting on the pale skin. Overhead, I began to hear the gentle tapping as the heavens opened and rain began to fall. I stopped about 6 feet away from the offshoot. I still couldn't see any more of the figure, but I wasn't taking any chances. I aimed the gun at the bit of exposed forehead I could see. "Okay, asshole, you listen, and you listen good," I snarled. "Right now, you have a 9mm aimed at your head, and right now, the man holding it has a fucking hair trigger." I expected a flurry of movement, for the figure to dash to their feet, but they remained still. Great, I'm dealing with one of those types. I spoke again. "You murdered someone I cared about, and ignoring me right now is not something you want to be doing, so get up." There was still no movement from the person. I let myself begin to boil over, seeing red. This person could easily sit there and not give a damn about having a gun on him, and not a care in the world about the life he snuffed out. I made the rash, split-second decision. "Fine, have it your way then." I growled, then moved forward to him. A second later, the edge of the pipe revealed the person. All anger died away in an instant, replaced with a massive dose of shock. Glassy eyes, which had already clouded over, stared up at the top of the pipe. The mouth was wrenched open in the same scream I'd seen on Fred's face. From what I could tell, it looked like a woman. Another homeless person, just like Fred. The dirt-streaked face and shirt gave it away, as did the needle marks in her arm. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Couldn't see her lower half. It was just out of sight around the bend, but the part I could see made me want to throw up. Just like Fred. A large chunk of her chest looked as though it had been bitten or scooped away, stretching from her shoulder and out of sight. "What the fuck?" I managed out, swallowing back the bile surging up in my throat. That was when the body moved. I froze, staring down at the bit of her I could see. I knew for certain she was long dead, and yet she just visibly shifted. I shook my head slightly. I must just be seeing things, I thought. And then I heard it. I heard a soft but deep breathing. It almost sounded like soft growling, the sound you'd hear a dog make when it's about to attack. And then the body was suddenly yanked backwards into the offshoot. The explosion of movement caused me to stumble backwards, and I slipped on a patch of seaweed, falling onto my elbows. The beretta fell from my hand, and I looked down, fumbling for it in the gloom. What snatched my attention away as I felt my fingers close around the muzzle was the sound which emanated from the offshoot. I looked back up and just about pissed myself, clutching the corner of the offshoot, looking as though it were about to pull whatever it was attached to out. Was an enormous hand. Hand wouldn't be the right word to describe it though. Claw would be more appropriate, because each of the 4 digits I could see ended in large, bone-colored talons. They curved in wickedly, impaling the plastic of the pipe and piercing right through. The soft growling sound became louder, and I saw muscle flex underneath what looked like black skin. I realized with a wave of horror that whatever was in the offshoot was about to pull itself out into the main pipe. And I was certain in that moment of 2 things. That I didn't want to see what it belonged to, and that if I stayed where I was, I would be joining Fred and the woman in a few seconds. As much as I felt terrified turning my back to the offshoot, I forced myself to turn and began moving back down the pipe as quickly as I could. My labored, ragged breaths echoed off the plastic, and I fought not to lose my footing and fall. I'm a dead motherfucker if I fall on my face for even a second right now. I made it about 3/4 of the way to the corner when I heard it. It sounded like a cross between a growl and the most cruel, evil laugh I'd ever heard, echoing down towards me from the other end. Where it was, I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to stare back over my shoulder. And I wish to this day, and will until the day I die, I hadn't. The shafts of rapidly dwindling light from above barely illuminated the pipe. I could barely make out anything in the gloom. Thankfully, it meant I couldn't see whatever it was in great detail. But it was enough to show one detail. I'd been going slow, even trying to crouch run in the cramped space. This thing, though, had no problem whatsoever in that department. I could tell because the darkened shape of it was, for lack of a better word, barreling down the pipe at me. I could hear the crunch as the talons on its hands jammed into the pipe, propelling it forward. In that span of realization, it had halved the gap between us. I didn't even realize I was mumbling. "Oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck," I mumbled. In that instant, I was certain that this was about to be the end of my life. A mental image flashed through my mind, one of my own lifeless body lying in the pipe, which would become my tomb, a huge chunk. No, an actual bite in my chest. The thought made me remember in a burst of adrenaline what I was still holding, and as it closed to within 20 feet of me, enough for me to begin to see it was covered in seaweed and kelp, I raised the Beretta and began firing. I didn't aim anywhere specifically. I just pointed and squeezed rapidly, screaming in abject horror as I began backpedaling around the corner and down towards the shaft of life, which was my salvation. As I did, I heard it let out another sound, one which seemed to be a mix of pain and rage at its newest prey putting up a fight. The gun clicked empty, and as I kept backpedaling, I grabbed a fresh magazine from my belt as I ejected the old one. I saw the claw grab the edge of the corner, and I slammed the full mag into the gun and aimed at it. That's when it began to lunge. Not just a half growl, half laugh, a full-bodied laugh as if it had just found something absolutely hilarious. It held a sick, wet gurgle to it, as if it were laughing through a mouth of seawater. For me, there was nothing funny about this situation. If anything, the fact it had begun to laugh filled me with even more dread and horror. The fucking thing is enjoying this. I knew any second it would launch around the corner and come after me, and so I began pulling the trigger again, dumping the entire magazine into the thing's hand and the corner of the pipe. And then, I was falling out of the mouth of the pipe. I hadn't even realized that I'd made it to the end until the wind was knocked out of me as I slammed into the sand and rocks. For a second, sheer panic consumed me. I was certain it was coming down to grab me by the ankle and drag me back into the pipe to my death. That was when I realized I wasn't alone. And it wasn't a sight which wasn't exactly pleasant. I was staring straight down the barrels of about a dozen pistols. Pistols which were held by stony-faced police officers. Quickly recognized my predicament and hastily dropped the Beretta, raising my hands palm up. "Please, don't shoot. For the love of God, don't shoot," I exclaimed. For a moment, the guns didn't waver, and then a familiar face came into view. Ray pushed past the other officers, looking down at me with a mixture of anger and exasperation. "Nate, what the flying fuck are you doing? We could hear the gunshots from all the way down the beach." I didn't answer him. I just pointed into the pipe. "In there! It's in there!" I almost screamed. I saw the officers hesitate and slowly lower their weapons, confused looks on their faces. The same look crossed Ray's face. "What is in there?" he asked seriously. I kept stammering. There's another body in the pipe. A woman's. And there was something else in there. Something which charged me. I had to shoot at it to slow it down." Now I saw all the officers shift their gaze from me to the dark interior of the pipe, their guns raised slowly towards it. All of them knew I wouldn't make up anything so serious, and especially wouldn't fire my gun unless absolutely necessary. Ray reached down and hauled me to my feet, then reached down and picked up my gun. He tucked it into his waistband, then turned to the officers. "Radio this in. Right now. Then break out the shotguns and flashlights. Once I escort the witness to the police station, we're going down the pipe. Do not lower your guards, and do not lower your guns." And with that, he began to lead me back down the beach. I knew better than to argue with him about going to the station for questioning, as much as I hated the small rooms with the metal tables and chairs, complete with the one-way glass. After the experience I just had, it wouldn't be even half as bad. "Now who or what exactly did you see in there?" he asked me as he pulled open the passenger door of his unmarked cruiser. I looked up at him as I sat down in the seat, the horror and dread still circulating in my system. I just shook my head at him. He shot a look back at where the officers were converged around the entrance to the pipe, then the door shut and strode around to the driver's side. As he climbed in, the rain began to fall from a drizzle into a downpour. I knew as he started the engine and backed the car out of the space that I had just stepped neck deep into something beyond my understanding or comprehension that, like it or not, I was now a part of. I caught a glimpse of one of the storm drains set into the side of the curb as we began to drive down the street. I saw the blackness which enveloped the interior of it. It now reminded me of a monster's maw poised open to devour anyone careless enough to get too close. And I shivered as the horrifying image of that thing charging towards me and laughing replayed itself over and over in my mind. "Lot of fucking help you guys were." That was what I mumbled as I stepped out of the police station after spending the last 3.5 hours being questioned and interviewed. The downpour had thankfully abated somewhat, though I was still forced to begin walking the 10 or 12 blocks back to where my car was parked by the beach in drizzling rain. Ray and the police chief had been the ones to interview me, and while they believed I'd seen something down in that flood and drainage pipe, I could tell they didn't believe what I told them. More than likely, they're just chalking that up to some kind of mental break over seeing the body. The thought was disheartening. I'd worked with the police on so many cases before, and no matter how ridiculous a scene I described to them, they'd always believe me. Now, I felt like I was an outsider to them, with the looks I seen them give me. As I rounded the final corner, my car coming into view, I saw a flurry of movement near it. Someone who had been standing by the front of it was dashing down the road away from me. "Hey!" I shouted, beginning to run after them. But after less than 5 seconds of my attempt, I gave up as I saw whoever it was round the corner and disappear behind a building. There was no way I was catching up to them. Catching my breath for a moment, I began striding to my car, hoping I wouldn't find another broken windshield or something. The amount of vandalism I got for the reporting I did was beyond ridiculous. Another reason I chose to stay with my 30-year-old car instead of buying a new one. As I drew close, however, I saw a sheet of paper tucked underneath the passenger windshield wiper, fluttering in the breeze. I reached across the windshield and pulled the paper out and unfolded it. Someone who clearly did not have the best handwriting in the world had written me a note. I have seen it as well. Meet me down by the fishing docks tonight at 8:30, and I'll tell you what I know. There was no signature. I looked around, then folded the note back up and slipped it into my pants pocket, debating what to do. But after an extremely short deliberation, I decided I would go tonight and find out what I could. The police had given me my pistol back when I left, which meant I wouldn't be showing up unarmed and vulnerable. I did, however, reach into my car and pull out my cell phone, dialing Kevin and explaining the situation. Even if my editor was hungrier for a story than the personal safety of his employees, it'd pay to let someone know where I was going. Surprisingly though, he gave me a bit of warning. "Just be careful down there tonight, Nate." His voice reverberated through the speaker. "You had one close call today. Let it be enough for now." I didn't know how to respond to the abrupt change in his demeanor, and so simply told him I would be and hung up. When even Kevin's telling me to be careful, I know this is an extremely bad situation, I thought. Extremely bad, but also something that, as much as the sensible part of my mind was telling me to let go, I knew would make one hell of a story, even more so than when I started the day. Before I got in my car to go home and change for tonight, I walked to the railing which ran alongside the sidewalk. It was right on the edge of the cliff, and looking straight down, I could see over half a dozen police officers still milling around by the mouth of the pipe. The body of the woman had already been pulled out hours ago, something I'd heard the chief whisper to Ray in the interview room, but I could tell they were still scouring the inside. I could hear their voices echoing up to me from the storm drains behind me. For a moment, the memory of crouching in that pipe and staring at the horror charging at me returned, and its waterlogged laugh echoed in my brain, causing me to shiver. Shaking it away, quickly walked back to my car and climbed in. I only had a few hours before the meeting time arrived. Time to make the most of it and prepare before then. At exactly 7:45 in the evening, with the last rays of the sun disappearing over the Pacific, I climbed into my car, carrying a small duffel bag containing items I brought along just in case, and began my drive down the docks. The streets seemed eerily empty, though I did occasionally pass another car or truck. The fog bank, which I'd heard the lighthouse warn of earlier, had finally arrived, and I drove slowly through the enveloping white haze, which made the streets and buildings seem to shimmer. It felt almost like I was driving through a dream, or in this case, a nightmare. I shook my head. Couldn't let my mind get the best of me now. I needed to stay sharp. With 15 minutes before the meeting time, I pulled into the parking lot for the fishing docks. The only other signs of life was 2 old beat-up pickup trucks, which no doubt belonged to fishermen who were working late into the night on their boats. After double-checking my gun was securely strapped in its holster, I stepped out of the car, slinging the duffel bag over my shoulder and slamming the door shut. The smell of the ocean mixed with the putrid scent of dead fish, and I wrinkled my nose slightly at the odor. Just soldier through it and find the person where you still can, Nate. Nodding in agreement with myself, I strode forward, stepping onto the creaking wood of the upper dock area. There were 2 sections to the fishing dock. A long upper section stretched straight out into the ocean for about 300 or 400 feet, where the fishermen set up their stalls and shops to sell their catch, and almost a maze of floating docks underneath it where the boats would tie up. After about 5 minutes of walking around the upper section, it became clear that whoever I was here to meet wasn't up here. Welp, looks like I'm heading down to the bottom, I mumbled as I crossed the metal gangway which connected the 2 sections. It rattled and vibrated slightly as I quickly walked down it, sounding far too loud in the fog and the overwhelming silence, only broken by the sound of the lighthouse's foghorn in the distance and a channel marker buoy letting out a soft gong somewhere out in the bay. As I stepped onto the first section of the lower docks, my sense of balance became off slightly as it bobbed and moved with the waves. I let out my breath slightly. As much as I loved living by the ocean, I was far better on land, and almost definitely did not have sea legs like the fishermen did. I felt a bit better after a moment later, and began to wind through the maze of wooden docks and fishing boats. Every so often, a pole adorned with a dim yellow light would appear out of the mist, keeping me from having to break out the flashlight. I also saw 2 of the boats with their cabin lights on, confirming my suspicions about the fishermen. However, I began to feel slightly put out as I checked my watch. The hands told me it was 8:27. Where the hell is this person? I wondered. The labyrinth of boats and docks seemed to go on forever, but I could tell I was approaching the end of them as I could see the end of the upper section above me. As I rounded what had to be one of the final corners, I finally saw someone. What looked like a man draped slightly in the fog stood near the end of one dock in between 2 boats. I took a deep breath and then slowly walked towards them, purposely letting my feet rap louder than normal on the wood to signal my presence. When I was within 10 feet, the figure turned to me. "That's close enough, sir," came a voice which confirmed it to be a man. I stopped and raised my hands to show I meant no harm. "No problem." I squinted, as if doing so would help me see through the thick white shroud separating us. "Are you the one who left the note on my car earlier?" I asked. "I am," he said, then slowly walked forward until I could see him well. Instantly, I could tell he was homeless. The torn, ragged, and dirty clothing gave it away, as did the dirt-covered face and stringy white hair. He looked to be in his mid-60s, an unkempt, mangy beard covering the lower half of his face. That would explain how he could possibly know about whatever I saw down there. I patted the duffel bag at my side. "I'm willing to pay for any information you can give me about any of this," I declared, hoping it would sway him to be completely open with me. It seemed it had done the trick. I saw the man's eyes lit up, and he smiled, revealing that he did not have many teeth left in his mouth. Then, he grew solemn again. "While I'm happy to take the money," he began, waving his hand, "I'm doing this because so many of us have gone. So many of us have been taken, and the truth needs to be told." I nodded, feeling myself relax somewhat at his words. The man didn't seem like he'd be much of a threat to me. He continued, "You saw it today, down in the pipe, didn't you?" I cocked my head, wondering how he knew about that. The thought was answered a moment later. "I was standing up near your car when I heard the gunshots and saw you fall out of the pipe." His eyes narrowed. "I heard you scream about something being in the pipe." The eyes softened, and he looked away, and I saw the cops pull Angie's body from it an hour later. Instantly, a wave of sympathy for the man welled up inside me. He knew the woman. Most of the homeless knew each other well around here. I spoke up. "Well, if you can give me some good information, I'll make sure to have my editor put this on the front page of the paper." My assurance seemed to make the man feel better, and he nodded. I reached into my jacket pocket and made sure the pocket recorder was on before continuing. "Do you know what it is?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't have a clue what it is, but I know where it comes from," he said, his voice low. "Where?" I asked him. In response, he turned and pointed out to the dark ocean behind him. Many of us, myself included, have seen it, walking out of the sea and onto the beach in the middle of the night. It comes in for a while, goes off and does whatever it does, then walks back into the waves before dawn. I felt a small pang of confusion whip over me. But wait, if you say it returns to the ocean before daybreak, why did I come across it during the middle of the afternoon? I asked. In response, he gave me an apprehensive look, as if my words had been what had made the realization sink in. It's getting bolder then, he said simply. I felt a small chill ripple through me, though I told myself it was from the cold wind coming from off the water. I needed to keep the man talking. Why haven't you gone to the police though? I asked him. If you are being taken by this thing, why not tell them what's happening? He gave me a look of disgust. Do you think we haven't tried telling them? We have, many times. Even I have before. They just write our warnings off as the product of booze, drugs, or just plain craziness. He looked down at the ratty sneakers on his feet, then spoke softly. When it began taking us, first one at a time, then 2 or 3, we tried telling anyone we thought we could, but we were just ignored. Another well of sympathy rushed through me for him. I began to ask my next question when a strong wave or a piece of flotsam hit the bottom of the dock we both stood on, causing us both to sway slightly off balance. After regaining it, I continued. When did this start? He shrugged. Around the end of December, beginning of January, I think. The dock shuddered under our feet again, and I decided to end the interview fast. The last thing I wanted to do was get knocked off into the water. But before I could ask my last question, he spoke up again. Johnny told me once that he's seen it go into the caves a lot down the coast, he said. I kept silent for a moment, trying to piece together where he meant in my mind. There's a lot of caves along the coastline, but where could he? Oh, of course, the Sea Lion Caves. Just down the coast from town was a bit of a tourist attraction. A mass of caves connected to the ocean, which were often occupied by a large colony of sea lions. That had to be what the man was talking about. I nodded, unzipping the bag and pulling out a small stack of $20 bills. In total, about $300. I held it out to the man, who after a nervous moment, reached out and took it, nodded gratefully at me, then backed away again. Before I go, I need to ask you one last question, I said. He nodded again. I took a deep breath, unsure of whether I wanted an answer to my final question. No, I needed it, both for the story and my own insatiable curiosity. Do you know what it looks like? I asked. Instantly, I knew that he did. The look of sheer horror which became plastered on his now pale face instinctively made me shudder. It was as if I'd asked a hospital patient who'd been brought back to life and had seen hell what it looked like. He opened his mouth a time or two, his voice seeming to catch in his throat. Then he held up a hand, silently asking me to give him a second. I nodded, as he opened his mouth to finally answer. The biggest bump to the bottom of the dock came. I almost went sprawling onto the dock, or worse, into the dark water. My saving grace came in the form of one of the light poles, which I grabbed onto to stay on my feet. As I pulled myself completely upright, my ears were assaulted by a piercing scream. From the direction it came, I could tell it was the man, and I worried for a moment he'd hurt himself. I turned back, ready to help him to his feet, even take him to the hospital if needed. And I froze. I could feel the blood draining from my face and my jaw drop open. I wanted to scream out, but it felt as if it had been trapped in my esophagus. The man had fallen down, lying sprawled across the wet wood. But that wasn't what had shocked me into inaction. It was what was gripped tightly around one of his legs. A claw. A very familiar black-skinned claw which ended in inwardly pointing talons. Talons which now pierced deep into the man's calf muscle. What had caused him to scream? Dark red blood dripped from the punctures, pooling onto the wood in a small puddle. I looked down and saw that the hand disappeared into the dark water, and felt another wave of horror course through me at the realization. It wasn't waves or junk we felt hit the underside of the docks. It was that thing. It's been under us the whole damn time. I saw the man gripping desperately onto the opposite edge of the dock, and I realized that it was attempting to pull him into the ocean, where only God knew what it would do to him. I dropped my back and exploded into motion, dashing to the man's side. He kept one hand in a death grip around the wood, but reached out with the other and took my outstretched hand. "It's okay. I've got you. I've got you," I yelled at him. He let out another scream, and I saw the claw had sunk its talons deeper into his leg. His eyes stared up at me, filled with a mixture of sheer terror and desperation. "Don't let go! For the love of God, don't let go of me!" He screamed out in my face. I tightened my grip on his hand and wrist, determined to do what I could to keep him here. What happened next happened in a fraction of a second. I saw the muscles in the claw tense up, and the next, the man was wrenched out of my grasp. I heard the bones in his hand gripping the dock break with a sickening sound and caught a glimpse of his terrified face as he began to let out another scream. And then, it was abruptly cut off as he was yanked beneath the waves with a huge splash. A rapid stream of bubbles rose to the surface for a moment, then stopped. I sprang to my feet, rapidly backing away from the red streak of blood, which marked the last spot the man had been. Fuck me, man. I gasped out as I reached down and snatched up my back. Bang. I was nearly sent off my feet as the dock was violently slammed into from below. Shit. It was trying to knock me into the ocean now. I saw that claw reach up and grab the edge of the dock, two of its talons adorned with ribbons of flesh from its last victim. I didn't think anymore, not about the gun on my waist or anything. I just turned and booked it. I dashed down the stretch of dock to the next connecting section. "Get me off this fucking maze," I screamed internally as I kept rounding corner after corner. I hoped one of the fishermen aboard their boats would have heard the commotion and come out to check, but nobody's face appeared. Bang. I flew off my feet, the world falling away beneath me as it was rammed from below. For one terrifying moment, I was sure I was going to plunge headfirst into the water. I knew if I did, I would never see the surface again. Instead, I slammed face first into the hardwood of the dock. Instantly, I felt the warm well of blood begin flowing freely from my nose, which had slammed into the dock first. I tried pulling myself to my feet, then screamed as the claw practically leapt out of the water, its talons poised to snatch me. I rolled out of the way seconds before it would have grabbed my leg, then struggled to my feet. Bang. I began to run again, almost losing my balance again. I looked behind me, still seeing the claw gripping the edge of the dock. It didn't appear as though it were pursuing me. For a second, I gave a silent prayer of thanks. Bang. I lost my footing again, this time crashing into one of the light poles, sending a zap of pain into my shoulder where it collided with it. For a moment, confusion overtook me. What the hell was that? It's still back there. That's when a sight appeared, which made the horror I'd already experienced pale in comparison. A claw appeared, trying to snatch my foot in its grasp, and I leapt back from the pole. As I did, I noticed that this claw was missing the talon on its middle finger. Not to mention, it was slightly lighter in color than the other. "Oh fuck," I moaned out. "There's more than one of these things?" The horrifying realization made me turn and began running faster than I ever had in my life. I likely would have given Usain Bolt a run for his money as I ran through the hellish labyrinth of docks and boats. Every time I would make my way onto a new section, I would feel it get rammed from below. There's a fucking group of them. Adrenaline coursed through my body for the second time that day, and I ran faster, somehow able to stay on my feet. I couldn't help but let out a scream of my own, one which matched the poor man's in terror as I kept seeing claw after claw try grabbing me from the black water. And then, I rounded the corner, almost breaking into sobs as I saw my savior, which was the metal gangway ahead of me. I dashed into it, sprinting up towards the upper section of the pier. It seemed to take forever, but finally, I reached it, slamming into the wooden railing opposite the gangway so hard that, for a moment, I feared I'd break right through the aging structure. I stood there for what had to be 10 to 20 seconds, but felt like forever, clutching the railing in a death grip and gasping for air from my burning lungs. Finally, I stood up, still breathing heavily, but feeling okay enough to stand on my own. I turned and looked back down the gangway. For a moment, I was afraid that I would see a dark figure at the bottom of it, or worse, a group of them, staring up at me with red, glowing eyes and laughing before rushing me. But nothing was there. The talk had fallen eerily and completely silent. The only two sounds I could hear were the foghorn and the soft gong of the channel marker buoy somewhere out in the fog. They hadn't followed me, I thought. But why? They could easily have gotten me here. I didn't know the answer, and I knew I wouldn't find out anytime soon, if ever. A thought crossed my mind quickly, and I jammed my hands into my pocket. Shit. I sped out into the dark. My recorder had fallen out of my pocket in the race to get off the hell below me. It likely had slid off into the water. Even if it hadn't, there was no way in hell I was going back down there to check. Even though the area was silent, I was overcome with the feeling of being watched by many different pairs of eyes. They were still down there, below the waves, looking up at me. Instead, I turned and began to jog back towards the parking lot. Reaching the car, I unlocked the door and dropped inside, slamming it shut and making sure it was locked before anything. I leaned over and unzipped the duffel bag now lying on the passenger seat, at the same time pulling a packet of tissues out from the ashtray in the center console. I found what I was looking for, dropping the cell phone into my lap before using some of the tissues to stop my still bleeding nose. Then, I flipped the phone open, finding the number I'd been looking for and dialing it. After a few moments, I heard the line pick up, a groggy and irritated voice greeting me.
Nate, you better have a good reason for waking me up when I need to be awake by 4 tomorrow.
Ray's voice grumbled.
Ray, you need to get out of bed and meet me at the 24-hour diner in town right now.
I said urgently, the tissues in my nose giving me a voice which almost resembled Squidward's from the SpongeBob children's cartoon. I didn't give him a chance to retort.
Meet me there in 15 minutes. It's an emergency.
And with that, I flipped the phone closed, dropping it back into the bag. I pulled my car keys from the back, jamming them into the ignition, and starting the motor. As I backed out and began to drive away to my meeting with Ray, I cast one final look down at the black water. For a moment, I swore I could see the exact red glow of eyes I'd imagined, watching me from just beneath the surface. I cannot believe I let you talk me into doing this. I only spared a glance at Ray as we tore down the coastal highway towards the Sea Lion Caves, the wind blowing straight off the Pacific, buffeting the car around like it was a toy. I mean, you called me up in the middle of the damn night, making me get out of bed to meet you at some hole-in-the-wall diner, only to tell me that you met some homeless dude down at the docks, who, after telling you a bit about what he says has been taking the homeless, then got grabbed by one and dragged on the water, and then proceeded to chase you off the docks yourself. He snorted. Oh wait, I'm sorry. You said a group of them chased you off the dock. I could see him shoot me a glance as he kept his hands tight on the steering wheel of his cruiser. No offense, Nate, but do you have any idea of how absolutely insane you sound right now? I drew in a deep breath, then let it out slowly. Look, you sent the officers down to the docks, and they found the blood, didn't they? I asked. Sure, they found blood, but for all I know, that could be from a fish that got gutted or something, he said. He began to say more, which I cut him off. For fuck's sake, Ray, we've known each other for how many years now? Have you ever known me to tell you something that wasn't truthful? That I wasn't absolutely sure about? I saw him set his jaw tightly. I could tell he didn't want to believe my story, but it seemed he was slowly fighting himself on that. No, he finally said, and chose to stay silent for the rest of the drive. I was grateful for it. I already felt on edge about where we were going. We're going straight into the lion's den, both figuratively and literally. In my head, I couldn't help but replay my last 2 encounters with the creatures. Flashes of blur in the pipe, the laughter, along with claws snatching the poor man and trying to do the same to me, danced behind my eyelids as I closed them. I opened them again as I felt the car begin to slow, seeing the sign ease by on our right. Visit the famous Sea Lion Caves. See the majestic creatures lounging and playing. And then, almost plastered over the main lettering with a temporary banner. Sorry, we're closed for the season. We'll reopen in late April. Ray brought the car to a halt, putting it in park and looking out at the stone steps which led down to the cave system next to the darkened visitors center framed in the headlights. He looked at me with a hard expression. Well, we're here, he said slowly. I just pray for once you are nuts or pulling my leg. I said nothing, only unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed open the passenger door. My nostrils were immediately invaded by the cloying smell of the ocean which lay a few hundred feet below us, and the biting wind made me happy I kept my thick jacket on. I heard the driver's door slam and spared a look back. Ray had popped the trunk to his cruiser and was currently moving back towards it. He pushed it all the way open, reaching inside and fumbling about for a few moments. He came up a moment later, holding what had been hooked to the back of the trunk lid, a police-issued 12-gauge shotgun. I could see the flashlight mounted underneath the pump, which he flicked on, casting a bright white light onto the ground. You have anything to defend yourself if necessary? He asked me. In response, I raised my coat, showing him the pistol still holstered on my hip. Of course, nearly forgot about that. He muttered, hooking a belt which contained additional shells onto his own waist and slamming the trunk shut. Alright, come on. Remember, we do one and only one sweep of the caves. I'm going to let dispatch know where I am. And if we do happen to find anything down there, Don't play hero. Got it? We get our asses back up here and call for backup. He narrowed his eyes at me. Got it? He repeated. Got it. I said. After a moment of scrutiny, he nodded, then turned and began to lead the way across the empty parking lot. Another fog bank was beginning to come in. I could see the first white tendrils rising from the cliff ahead, snaking in like a kraken's tentacle to ensnare the very ground we tread on. I made sure my own flashlight was hooked safely to my own belt, then followed my friend as he began to make his way down the rather steep stone steps carved into the side of the cliff itself. We said nothing as we passed by an empty wooden stand, which during the tourist season held pamphlets. The further we went, the steeper the steps seemed to get. I'd never visited the caves myself before, so everything was new and alien to me. All I could hear was the massive crash the ocean waves made as they slammed into the side of the cliff, amplified through the opening to the caves in front of us. The blare of the foghorn came, louder than I was used to, seeing as the lighthouse stood only a mile from where we were. Then, it all became muted as we entered the caves themselves. The metal railing set into the side of the path was the only thing keeping anyone from plunging straight down the bottom of the caves and the water which rushed into them. Glad they're here, I honestly thought. I could hear a loud and dripping sound somewhere above our heads, and the steps began to feel more slimy and harder to stay upright on as we wound our way down. Thankfully though, the feeling of ice I'd had on me during both encounters wasn't washing over me now. They must still be out down near town. It meant we had a little time to explore, though I didn't know how long. Finally, the steps dropped out and turned into a level path, but as I rounded the last corner, I found myself slamming into the back of Ray. I nearly went sprawling backwards onto my ass, and my nose throbbed painfully where it had collided with his shoulder. Ray, what the hell, man? I hissed at him as I rubbed it, but he said nothing. Ray? I asked again. He still didn't respond. I felt a chill run up my spine. This was not the way Ray usually behaved. If you asked him a question, even in a stressful situation, the man would always answer you. I know, since he'd saved my bacon multiple times before when I'd let my journalistic side get me in over my head. I leaned around him, flicking on my own flashlight and aiming it in the vague direction where his shotgun mounted one pointed, and froze. Oh God, I said quietly. Caught directly in the beam of both of our lights was the head of a sea lion, a very, very dead sea lion, and I knew that since it was quite literally just a head, decapitated from the rest of its body. To make the morbid scene even worse, it had been jammed down onto one of the railing's poles, the poor creature's mouth pulled back to reveal its sharp teeth, almost like some kind of crude warning to stay out. I gently reached out and put my hand on Ray's shoulder. He almost jumped for a second, then seemed to regain his composure. Okay, I didn't expect that, he said evenly, but I could see his eyes now held a little apprehension. Ray was a huge ocean lover, part of the reason he'd moved to the coast. And to see the sea lion, an animal he loved, butchered and used like an ancient tribe's warning, must have really got under his skin. His eyes hardened, and he nodded at me. We go slow from here out, he whispered. I nodded, and then we slowly moved on, past the head. We began to pass more decapitated animal heads as we drew closer to the bottom of the cave, where I knew there was a large viewing platform down onto where the sea lions would normally lay. I had drawn my pistol, holding the Beretta tightly in my right hand as I shone the flashlight around with my left. Even though the cave felt empty, it still held an almost threatening atmosphere, along with a building sense of dread which was beginning to well up in my gut as we approached the platform. Finally, we stepped onto the platform itself. In reality, it was just a large, rather flat rock formation which had been encircled with a rather tall railing. The roar of the ocean was almost deafening in here, and every time it came in, I felt the stinging sensation of cold seawater splash my face. Thankfully, we saw no more sea lion heads on the railing posts here. In my head, I'd almost imagined that every post down here would have one mounted on it. Instead, all I saw were the dark shapes of rocks on the other side of it, and the even darker shape of the ocean as it rushed in and out below us. I let out a deep breath, then turned to Ray. Well, I'm hoping by that lovely little spectacle we witnessed down there that you might believe me a little more by now, huh? I said, my voice echoing in the large open area. He kept his back to me, looking out towards the hole which led out to the open ocean. But I saw him nod his head. While I'm not sure if I'm ready to believe that some kind of creature from the Black Lagoon or humanoids from the deep monsters are behind it. Yeah, I can believe you saw something, and we found his, their, whoever's hideout where they've been. I was about to reply to him when something dripped down onto my shoulder. A tad, the condensation, which must have rose to the roof of the caves, dripped down onto me a few times on our descent. But this felt different. It felt thicker, almost sticky in a way, and I tucked the pistol into the crook of my arm and reached out to touch whatever had dropped onto me with my fingers. I felt my heart begin to race in my chest as I pulled my fingers back and shined the beam of light on them. The dark red color was unmistakable. Blood. I swallowed hard, wiping my fingers on my jacket and snatching the Beretta back into a hand, which now shook slightly. Ray? I asked, my shaking voice betraying the fear I began to feel envelop me. What? He whispered, turning to look at me. But as he did, I saw his eyes slide from my face to the area on my shoulder where the blood had dropped. And then they slid to something just over my right shoulder. I saw his pale face, his eyes growing about as wide as a human's possibly could. A huge shiver went down my spine as I felt like a character in a horror movie who'd had something behind them the entire time and never realized it. Oh, fuck my life. I really don't want to turn around. But I forced myself to, after moving forward a few steps first. And I'm pretty sure my face became as pale as the man's standing beside me. Neither of us had shot a look at the back wall as we'd walked onto the viewing platform. Both of us had been too focused on the rocks and water in front of us, and too preoccupied in our own minds by the grotesque display of sea lion heads we'd seen. But compared to the sight before us, those might as well have been freaking Christmas ornaments. There were decapitated heads mounted on the poles of the back wall railing here, alright, but they weren't animal heads. I could see the fear plastered on every man and woman's face. The mouths of a few were frozen open in an eternal scream, and the glassy eyes were wide and unseeing. There were at least 10 or 12 human heads there, and as I raised my gaze along with my flashlight, I saw more perched on the small rocky outcroppings going up to the ceiling, where, oh good Lord Almighty, I could see bodies. The headless bodies were above us, almost too many to count. They had been hung by the ankles using a strange kelp-like rope. I could see massive bites taken out of some, and others looked like a Neanderthal had strung them up and rubbed salt to preserve them for later. As I lowered my gaze, one face stood out to me, and I nearly threw up. The face of the man I'd spoken to not even an hour and a half ago, the one who'd been dragged into the ocean, stared back at me. I could tell he'd died screaming. I pointed. That's the guy I spoke to tonight. I managed out. I saw Ray's gaze flicker to the face, then back towards the horrific scene in front of us and above us. Okay, this is the point where we get out of here and radio for backup, he said. I nodded, beginning to move for the steps, when the feeling washed over me. The feeling of being observed was back, and my spine felt like it had chills continuously shooting up it. Oh, fuck. I almost moaned out. What? Ray demanded, his grip growing tighter on the shotgun. I shot him a look, one which I know had to be filled with absolute dread and fear. I swallowed hard, then finally answered. We're not alone in here anymore. As I finished my sentence, the sound which, having only heard once, would already haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, came from behind us. The laugh, one which sounded like it was being done through a mouth of seawater. One which sounded like whatever was making it had just heard a hilarious joke. It was joined by a second, then a third, until the cave was awash with the sickening sound of sinister laughter. I slowly turned, realizing we'd left our backs open to the space beyond the railing, to the opening to the sea. Even without aiming the flashlight, I knew they were there. Because I'd been right when I swore I'd seen red glowing eyes staring at me from the water by the docks. I could see at least 4 or 5 pairs of them, staring at us from the dark. Ray spun around, aiming his shotgun towards them, and as the first reached up to grab the railing with the black claw I'd come to know far too well, I finally saw the creatures completely. When Ray had made this crack about them resembling something out of an old B-horror movie, I don't think he planned on being right. The closest comparison I can make would be similar to the monster on the poster for humanoids from the deep. They all had a humanoid shape to them, a large, slightly misshapen head adorning their shoulders. In the flashlight's beams, the red glow of their eyes seemed to turn to an inky blackness. Black, fish-like scales covered every square inch of their bodies, and seaweed and kelp clung to them as well. They almost seemed to wear it in the same way a sniper would wear a ghillie suit made of leaves and twigs to escape the eye of his targets. The dominating feature of their face was their mouths, one which stretched far too wide and large. They were filled with razor-sharp, shark-like teeth which reflected in the lights, and each curved up in the most nefarious and wicked grins I'd ever seen on any living being's face. Black claws stuck out from both their hands and feet, looking just as sharp. I saw all of this in what felt like minutes, but was in reality only seconds. The first of them began to haul itself up and over the railing. That was when I felt Ray shove me from the side. "Time to go, Nate," he shouted. I didn't waste time playing the hero, aiming my gun and trying to take them all down. I'd seen far too many horror movies to know where that gets you. Instead, I turned and booked it from the bottom of the steep steps back up to the top of the cliff, away from the nightmares the normally happy cave system had once been. I reached the bottom step and, resisting the urge to simply sprint up them, turned and aimed both my gun and flashlight back towards where I'd come. Ray's panicked and terrified face flashed into the light as he dashed towards me. Behind him, I saw the creature which had climbed over the railing first, dashing behind him. 2 huge gunshot wounds took up its chest, but it kept coming. I forced my hand still, concentrating on my aim as Ray ducked out of it. Without hesitating, I emptied the entire clip. Normally, my aim is always somewhat off. I can hit a decent general area, but I'd never do well in a sharpshooter competition. Now though, for the first time in my life, my aim was completely on point. Almost all of the 12 or 13 rounds slammed into the creature's head, with one going through one of the eyes. It stopped, as did seemingly all the rest behind it. For a moment, it glowered at me with its remaining eye, and then it crumpled into a head on the ground, dead. For a moment, a feeling of triumph surged through me. "Take that, you scaly son of a bitch," I screamed in my head, but it was chased away as a collection of roars. Roars of absolute fury assaulted my ears. I felt the biggest feeling of fear and dread yet course through me. "Oh shit, you just made them mad, Nate." Before I could think of anything else, Ray began shoving me up the stairs. "Go!" he ordered, and I moved, ejecting the spent magazine and slapping in a new one as I did. The cave began to shudder with the impact of the creatures as they began their rage-fueled charge at us. We weren't simply prey to them anymore. We'd killed one of their own and had thoroughly pissed them off. They were coming for revenge now. I skipped slightly on the steps as I led the way up. Looking up, I could barely see the opening, the night sky dotted with stars seeming like a guiding light. "Keep going," Ray shouted, firing again. I couldn't see the stairs below us anymore, but I could only imagine the creatures were jamming themselves onto it in pursuit of us. Suddenly, a squawk of static came from the radio on Ray's belt, just faintly over the roar of the creatures. I heard a man's voice yell out, cut off from the static coming from the interference the rocky walls of the cave had on the radio.
"Ray, me up. Back. People here. Retreat."
Looking up again, I saw flashing lights splashing the upper walls of the cave. Thank God, the cavalry's here. That's when something shot out of the darkness from my right. Tendrils of pain shot through my right arm, and I went sprawling forwards, slamming my head into one of the railing's poles. I tried climbing to my feet, pulling on my right arm as the pain seemed to intensify, and I screamed. Coming out of the darkness was one of the monstrosity's claws, one which had locked around my arm, the claws sinking into my skin and drawing blood. I saw the glowing red eyes appear from where it disappeared to. The claws shook me like a rag doll, and I felt the beretta torn from my grip, seeing it disappear into the blackness. I still held my flashlight in my free hand, and I shone it forwards, revealing the creature which clung to the railing. It had somehow climbed the sheer cliff face up to me, cutting off my escape and lying in wait. The grin on the creature was gone. Instead, a look of absolute hatred shone from its black eyes. For a moment, I thought it would pull itself up and over the railing. Instead, and to my horror, it began to pull me towards it, over the railing. "Ray, help me!" I screamed out. I could still hear the thunder of a shotgun just below me, but I didn't hear him respond. I screamed again. "Ray!" The shotgun stopped firing, replaced by an echoing silence. I shot another look at the creature which had me in its clutches. Now it was smiling, the most evil and malicious smile I'd ever seen. It began to laugh its horrible laugh, then pulled on my arm again. I dropped the flashlight, reaching out and locking my fingers into the railing mounted on the opposite side of the steps. But I knew it was a fight I couldn't win. Tears began to fall from my eyes as my arm was pulled on harder, the pain surging through me from it becoming almost unbearable. I opened my mouth and screamed as I closed my eyes. Not for Ray this time, or anyone else, but simply to make what I thought would be the final sound I would make on this earth. The thunder of the gunshot so close to my head sent a painful ringing through my eardrums, almost deafening me. Instantly, I felt the claw loosen and let go of me, and I fell into a heap on the mossy stone. A new collective roar came from below as I felt myself pulled to my feet. I opened my eyes to see Ray, who had put my good arm over his shoulder. I could see a large slash in one of his thighs. He didn't look at me, only ahead at the lights above. "Move your ass if you want to see the sunrise tomorrow," he ordered. I didn't hesitate. I moved my legs as fast as I could, my damaged arm dangling at my side. Together, and with the sounds of our pursuers growing ever closer, we dashed up the slowly spiraling steps. As we reached the second-to-last level, I looked up and winced at the flashlight shown in my face. At the multiple lights, actually. Dozens of serious faces stared down at us. One, an older man with gray hair and a mustache, motioned to us. "Come on, get up here," he shouted. We didn't need any encouragement though. Neither one of us stopped for a second, even though I could tell by the sounds that the creatures had stopped chasing us. As we stepped out into the night, I saw at least 4 or 5 black SUVs with flashing lights coming from behind their windshields, packed into the rather small parking lot. I saw a rather large cargo van behind them with its rear doors wide open. There were at least a dozen highly armed men in the lot, each of them holding military-style shotguns and rifles. I noted as a man reached out to grab me from Ray that they didn't have any police patches or insignias of any kind on their uniforms. As I was helped to the van, which turned out to have a medical station in it, I cast a glance behind me and saw the gray-haired man and about 7 or 8 men head down into the caves. Tell them to watch themselves," I said weakly, my head beginning to feel dizzy from the blood loss from my arm. The man helping me gave out a soft, almost amused snort. "Don't worry, son," he said gently as he sat me down on the back bumper. "They know what they're doing." Ray sat down on the other side of me, and as the man tended to both of our wounds, putting a patch on my arm, which he said would hold until I got to a hospital, and the same for Ray's leg, we both stared out at the entrance, waiting to see who or what would emerge. After about 10 or 15 minutes, the man reappeared. The gray-haired man handed his rifle to another, then strode across the parking lot to us. "You boys are damn lucky to have survived, you know," he said gravely. "You're some of the only ones that have after seeing them that close." I shot the man a look. "You mean you know about those things?" I asked him. He nodded. "We've known about them for a very long time, son," he answered. "We've been tracking them from here to the east and west coasts of North America, to Europe, Africa, hell, pretty much every coastline in the world." I saw Ray raise an eyebrow. The man's gaze seemed to harden as he looked from Ray to me. "I understand. You're a journalist, am I right?" he asked, gesturing to me. After a moment, I nodded. He nodded as well, then locked eyes with me. "Well, I'm afraid to tell you that you're not going to be printing a story about this. You're not going to be saying anything about this." I felt my jaw drop open. Are you kidding me?" I almost shouted. "People need to be warned about these fucking things. They need to know." The man's eyes almost seemed to harden more. I said, "You're not going to be saying or printing anything about what we've seen." He narrowed his eyes. "Ever," he declared. The message was clear, along with the last and implied threat which lay behind his green eyes. I was staring into the eyes of someone who, if I seemed like I'd make trouble for them, could easily make me disappear. I felt a sense of rage boil up inside me, but I held my tongue, shooting daggers at the man instead. After a few moments of the staring match, he turned to Ray. "And you're not going to say anything either, detective," he said simply. I expected Ray to protest, but instead, to my surprise, he simply nodded, looking for all the world like everything had drained out of him. "Good," the man said, turning away. "We'll see each other again once you recover in the hospital. Some of my men will take you there now, and one will return your cruiser to your precinct, detective. For now, we're done here." And with that, he walked away, back towards the steps. Ray and I were led to one of the black SUVs and helped inside. As it started up and began to turn around, I looked back one final time. I saw 2 men hauling a stretcher out from the steps. I couldn't see what they had on it completely due to the white sheet covering it, but I saw the black, scaled arm with the claw spilling out over the side. We were taken to the hospital where the man escorting us told the nurses on duty we'd been in an accident. The nurses didn't bother questioning what kind of accident it had been, only rushed us both to be seen by doctors. I was taken to surgery, where I had my torn open arm inspected and put back together. The surgeon on duty said I was lucky. I would keep my arm and eventually get all use of it back. I found out later Ray's injury hadn't been as bad as mine. He simply had his leg stitched up and was kept overnight for observation. We were visited by the gray-haired man, flanked by 2 of his cronies the next day, as he had said. He never gave me a chance to speak. Not caring what I had to say, in a very serious, almost deadly voice, he told me that the group he worked for would pay for my hospital bills along with compensation, which he told me was for helping them finally obtain a specimen. He also made it perfectly clear that if I breathed a word of what I'd seen, that there would be dire consequences for doing so. I had paper after paper placed on the food tray in front of me, all of which I was forced to sign against my will, saying I wouldn't say anything before they left. Which I'm breaking now by telling you. Seriously, I don't really care what happens to me after posting this. Yes, I fully admit I'm afraid of what's going to happen to me when I post it, but my sense of duty is stronger. I'm a journalist. I have a duty to the public to tell them about the truth, about anything that may pose a danger to them, even if they don't believe me, and I'm pretty sure you won't. After all, there are no news reports, local or otherwise, about the creatures, or the vanished homeless people. There was nothing said about what Ray and I had seen down in the sea lion caves. Hell, from what I hear, they're due to open in a few weeks for tourists. The thought of happy people, families, children traipsing through an area where all that horror was so little time ago, it makes me feel sick and shiver. I've seen Ray once since then. He wouldn't tell me much, only that all the files from the case had been taken. Old Fred and the woman's deaths had been labeled as murders from other homeless, something done for money or drugs. The case had been permanently closed. He also told me that the chief had been acting odd ever since, ordering him to never mention the case again. I'm leaving town. He confided in me as we sat in a bar, my arm in a sling as we drank. I'm transferring to somewhere far away from here. I can't bear being here anymore. He locked eyes with me as he paid for both our drinks and stood to leave. I suggest you do the same. So, that's what I'm doing. I'm packing a few bags and calling my landlord to tell him I'm leaving. I'll tell him to throw away or sell my furniture. I've already withdrawn a large amount of money from my bank account, courtesy of the gray-haired man and whoever he works for, whether it's the government or someone else. And I'm going to get into my car and go. I'm going to try and disappear, somewhere far away from the sea. Can't stand being near it anymore. Not after learning what lurks below the waves. But not before I warn you. Like I said, I don't care what happens once I get the word out. You need to know. You all need to know. Those things seem to have moved on from this town. There's been no further disappearances since that night. I can only assume they've moved on somewhere else. Somewhere far away from here. I realize I can't discourage you from staying away from the ocean. That's almost completely impossible. The ocean is too vital to humanity's survival. But I can warn you this. Stay away from the beaches and the shorelines at night. It doesn't matter whether you live in the US or anywhere else. Stay inside. Lock your doors and windows and draw your curtains. Because if you go out there, you may attract the attention of something you really don't want to have on you. Something which hunts along just about every coast in the world. You may see glowing red eyes staring at you from the darkness. And you may hear that vile, horrific laughter. Something I hear every night in my dreams. Chasing me from sleep to bolt upright. Covered in sweat. And it may just be the last sound you ever hear.